Hello and welcome to Fearless DIY Music. My name is Tristan Lass, and today I'm joined by my dear friend Kevin Gamble. He and I are going to discuss a topic later on in the show, but I think that he's got a few things that he'd like to talk about up front. So take it away, Kevin. What do you got?
Well, good to see you, Tris, and some more good content on the channel lately. That was some good thought-provoking content. You had a couple things recently that really got me thinking about kind of what we prioritize or what we incentivize in music these days. You had the video about one of your recent videos about avoiding using plugins or overusing plugins and getting finished sounds up front when recording. And that made me think about sort of the arms race of production values in music today. And it seems like maybe in the old analog days where no one doing DIY had access to professional sound quality, there was maybe more of an emphasis on the ideas in music, the musical ideas, the freshness and the innovation in your content and how distinctive it was. And whereas now it's kind of flipped on its head, where there seems to be less of a personal innovation in mainstream music and more innovation on just sort of the endless polish on the back end, where production values kind of trump anything musically interesting. And then you had a short this week about AI music and its threat to displace the human element in the streaming marketplace, which I thought was a really good point. It's happening quickly, and that just made me think about what's incentivized in kind of the new music distribution space of streaming, where gaming the system seems to be what is most incentivized now, instead of again, human innovation. And for some reason, it made me think back to an example of the opposite thing, going all the way back to, maybe the 70s, where Richard Branson started his career as a music mogul by signing Mike Oldfield, who ended up creating one of the strangest hit records ever with Tubular
Yeah,
Bells.
tubular bells, yeah.
I thought about that and say, the heyday of Yes and so forth. And it's like the incentives then were coming up with something that was so interesting and creative and artistically deep and compelling that it would just convince the world of its greatness. Nobody was taking a shortcut or gimmicking the system by signing Mike Oldfield. It was a shot in the dark. And then fast forwarding all the way today and seeing, AI creating sounds and creating an audience for sounds, and the incentive seems to be to bypass the human creative system altogether, just to get straight to the digital money. So it's an interesting contrast, and it does highlight how the human element is maybe under attack compared to at any point in the past, even over the years of Image First through MTV and so forth. It really highlights, I think, the importance of having something real to make and to say, because everything else is quickly becoming disposable if it lacks that element, and just a means to an end.
Yeah. I agree with all of that assessment. I'll just touch really briefly on the avoiding plugins thing. I wanted to make that as just a utility video for people who may have underpowered computers, using just what comes with a DAW rather than being able to afford buying all sorts of expensive things. And the cool thing is that you can find, relatively inexpensive outboard gear these days used in decent condition, and you can use it in exactly the way I describe in that video, which I will link in the description below if you have not had a chance to watch it. Going to the AI thing, I think that I don't know if that short connected the way that it was supposed to, but my main point about it was to illustrate that in fact, people are doing this at this point. And, if one person's been caught and managed to, over about a 4 or 5 year period, generate $10 million worth of revenue off of using fraudulent bot accounts and generating all content using AI, other people are doing this as well. And my main point in that video is that that's taking up a lot of creative space and a lot of revenue streams from legitimate artists, be they established or be they indies like myself and yourself. there's a pitiful amount of space for independent artists now, in the grand scheme of things in streaming platform. And to see somebody go in and manage to scoop $10 million out of the pot by just having a computer generate a bunch of, content, it's something to think about. And like I said, should it be banned? Should it be regulated? I'm not saying I have the answer to that part of the equation, but I think something should be done, especially if it is done in a fraudulent way, which is the way this Michael Smith character did it. So, it's not like he was following the rules of copyright and publishing and all that kind of stuff, So it's happening. It's already happening. And I think that was a real eye-opener for me reading that story this week. Like, oh, so this what Kevin and I were talking about a couple months ago is actually happening. So I thought that was interesting. Tie into.
Yeah, it really is. Just the contrast when you look at the bookend of that, someone gaming the system for that much money, and then Spotify demonetizing any content that gets fewer than 1,000 streams. It's kind of a tough road to hoe for new creators, and makes me question whether the system even wants new creators. But we have to keep doing it. We have to keep humanity in the middle of all of this.
Yeah, it's just the road seems to keep getting harder. So, it's just what we have to deal with, and that's why we're going to be here on the channel, and that's why we're going to continue to, just keep creating things ourselves, because got to keep that human element in there. Did you want to talk about anything else, or should I jump into the topic?
Just really quick, wanted to make a reference to the couple sort of unsavory rock star stories of the week. We had started off with Dave Grohl and his revealing of personal indiscretion, and then ended the week with the Jane's Addiction skirmish on stage. Whatever fed into it was not a good look, and it was just an interesting thing. It made me think back to some of our previous conversation about revisiting grunge and maybe reevaluating some of the things that were accepted and even celebrated in the past, and maybe that sort of stereotypical rock star behavior not being seen the same way now, not being seen through the same eyes as it once would have been, or even being seen when maybe before it would have been overlooked altogether. But I don't think either one of those incidents have been well received or enjoyed or spin in any positive way this week. It just seems like that kind of self-destructive behavior just doesn't really have any traction anymore, which seems like a positive thing.
It's just poor judgment, there's poor judgment, and just the habit, that habit of, I think that there's a danger in becoming famous, just period, for human beings. I think that there comes a point where a sustained period of being famous, or being, considered somebody who has been such a either an influencer or a trendsetter or a ready, steady cultural icon for an extended period of time, it just always seems to lead to some sort of poor decision making, or the ego is goes beyond the guardrails, or just you become maybe in Grohl's case somebody who thinks they can just kind of do whatever they want, or maybe Farrell thinks that he still needs to have certain things in his life to make him creative. I don't know. I can't go into the hearts and minds of either person to know what is going on internally. But yeah, it's a bad look, and it just feels so cliche at this point. I mean, all this stuff's well documented in the annals of music and art and movie making and writing and all of the arts. The self-destructive artist, or the somebody who, I have appetites and that's what drives my creativity, or whatever it is. It's just I don't think people buy it anymore. They shouldn't, because it's just I don't see it valid.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's leave all that behind. Something I do want to talk about, once again, one of my main points of this channel is to encourage people to do things with the stuff they have, or things that they can get relatively inexpensively, or even just making up your own stuff, or building your own instrument, or whatever it may be that you're interested in. I mean, so what I've noticed lately is, and this has been going on for quite some time. I think COVID really kind of brought it back to the surface because there's a lot of new money going into the music business at that point as far as gear, due to the fact that there are a lot of people who are interested in getting into music, and maybe they were older, at later stages in life where they have the income to be able to purchase most anything that their hearts desired. People of certain generations who have cultural icons as their personal heroes, and wanting to replicate the kind of things that those people played through. And what I wanted to discuss is just the continual flow of 100-watt tube amplifier options that keep flooding the market. I have a tube amplifier that, probably in a room, if I cranked my Showman all the way, it would give any Marshall or, any other 100-watt tube amp a run for its money, because those old black faces, I mean, it's a 65, the thing just pumps. And I have zero application for that amplifier. I think that most people, unless you're playing, you almost need to be in a theater or larger for a 100-watt tube amp to make any sense whatsoever. There's really no need for these pieces of gear. I'm not against tubes. I love these little amps that they're coming out with that have the watt reduction, so you can take it down to 1 watt and then you can crank it and get your tube saturation, but at bedroom volumes. I think that is a good move in the industry, and plus they're usually relatively inexpensive compared to the Big Brother 50 and 100 watt heads. And I guess I'm perturbed by the fact that, these products just keep coming, and they, I realize there is a certain market for it, but there has to come a point, right, where this stuff just stops being made, because most people are going to silent stages. Most people are using modelers on stage. The carbon footprint of moving around 100-watt stacks just isn't really a good look anymore either. We're talking about things that are now passé. The technology's there to not have to rely on these things. I get that people want, maybe if you want one and you lock it in a room somewhere and you put a mic in front of it because you want that sound, I guess I get that. But what are your thoughts on the idea of these high-powered tube amps that are just still being cranked out?
Yeah, it's a great point. It does kind of make you wonder where that tipping point is going to be for things that are pretty much clearly out of date when it comes to everyday common usage. There was a time where the really loud amp, whether it's guitar or bass or anything else, was just a requirement if you were working at a certain level. But
even
we're really
not. Even with us when we were younger, we had to have a certain amount of volume because there were no decent PA systems anywhere.
Yeah, you had to make the, intensity of your own sound playing with a drum set and so forth. But, we're really past that point where it's necessary for anyone. And even getting the recorded sound of it, between the best modelers and the best smaller amps, do you even really need any particular 100-watt plus amp to get that sound, to get the great sound? And so I'm not sure. There may be maybe people in the comments could offer, like, what is the purpose that we're not thinking of? What are we not covering? But it does seem like it's kind of running on fumes at this point. And not that we necessarily want the newest, latest digital thing to make everything obsolete. But this is an example, like you said, there's good solid state and tube technology that is still usable and appropriate and works in different settings, whereas this really doesn't anymore. But they can sell each one of those for, 10 or 20 times the cost of one of those little, bedroom amps. So is it just that, or, what keeps fueling this? Some things just seem like they who's buying them? What's the point in making them?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many smaller amp options out there, and there always have been. And then when you read about, how back in the day, and I'm going to tie this into some other things, back in the day, a lot of these iconic recording artists, they weren't using their live rigs in the studio. They were using little Supros, or they were using little underpowered, the Fender, the Fender Tweeds, the little small ones, like, and stuff. They were using those to record with in the studio, which I think is, hilarious that,
Yeah.
a lot of people known for 100-watt, stacks, actually were doing their recording with, with basically practice amps.
Yeah,
So
it's part of the illusion.
it's part of the illusion.
Giant amps. Yeah.
Which brings me to another illusion, which is, the seemingly, and I'm not against, and right up front, before I get murdered in the comments by anybody, I'm not against relicking guitars, okay? If you want a relic guitar that looks old and beat in, that's fine. That's great. My one word about that, though, is that there are abundant beat-to-crap guitars out on the used market, and you may have to refret it, and you may have to do a lot of work to it to get it up into, stellar playing condition. But if you want two beaten pieces of wood or a single beaten piece of wood, there are plenty of those floating around out there that can be resurrected and made into great players, which is something that I like to do. I like to buy, guitars that are previously reliced by other people. I don't have to do all of that myself. Anyway, that point aside, all of these, recreation guitars that are coming out, they're very expensive, and I understand why. I'm not going to argue with that. Murphy Lab, Fender Custom Shop, a lot of handwork is going into those instruments. I understand why they're so expensive, and that's great. But the interesting thing is that if you're buying recreation guitars, or you want something that's really heavily reliced, the guitar heroes of the 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond, but let's talk about the 50s, 60s, and 70s primarily, they weren't going and getting like old beat-to-crap guitars to play. They bought brand new off-the-shelf stuff all the time. They walked into guitar shops like, in New York, Manny's in New York, right? That's the name of the famous shop in New York. Gilmour would walk in there and just pick a brand new Strat off the wall. That was how the black Strat is born, and that guitar had been refinished, so he got a really good deal on it. They were looking for good deals in guitar stores, buying either lightly used or completely brand new instruments. Hendrix was famous for always wanting a fresh guitar. He was always buying a new Strat, and so the guitar heroes weren't, after these things that so many people now are after, and they played brand new stuff. And a good friend of mine back in Portland, Steve Bradley, he's a guy who's played with Dick Dale, and so he's a surf rock person, primarily known as that now, but he did R&B and stuff in the late 60s and early 70s. He was telling, I would always go, Steve, don't you wish you'd kept all those guitars? And he's like, no, we all wanted the newest thing. We wanted to go into that store and buy the latest model, brand new. They looked like candy. The finishes were perfect. As soon as a guitar had a scratch or a nick in it, it was over. It's like, I need to get a new guitar. I need something that looks good on stage. And then he was like, and then in the 80s, he worked at a guitar shop, and people would bring in 1950s and 60s Strats, and his mission, he was told to rip all the electronics out of them, route them out for humbuckers, and put Floyd Roses on them. And that's what people did. Yeah. And they made super Strats out of these vintage iconic guitars now that are worth so much money. And so I think that there is a value in just kind of looking back at down the tunnel to what people were actually doing with instruments back in these time periods, and think about the fact that you could walk into Guitar Center or whatever, just big box guitar store, find something that feels and plays really nice for you at a reasonable dollar amount, and then just play the garbage out of it for a long time. And I know some people go, oh, well, Poly doesn't. Well, Poly's been around for a long time, and I've got a lot of Poly guitars that are beat in. They do beat in eventually. Think about my black Strat. That's a polyurethane guitar, and that thing doesn't have any finish on the last half of the neck on it. You can, have that feel, and if you just want to roll your fingerboard, you can do that yourself. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think, there's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot of idealizing and mythology around a lot of these things. The easy response to that might be, well, sure, they wanted new instruments because everything was great back then. A
Late
new
60s stuff wasn't.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, it's like, but that would be the thought, is that now the new things then are the things that are prized now. But was it really, how much of that magic is is real and meaningful to the general audience. You know, we're not talking about a really fantastic guitarist who really bonds and associates with one particular instrument. They probably would hate if they tried 100 of the guitars that they became associated with. They'd probably hate half of them. They'd probably think that 25% of them were pretty good, and maybe 5 or 10% of them were really great. So even those classic periods of instruments, I doubt anyone who became famous at that point for playing any of those instruments would think that every guitar was great, and that there was something magical about the period they were in for that. And I think, you know, we would take their word for that. And so I think for the vast majority of people playing and creating, it's kind of a meaningless difference. And especially when you're talking about new guitars that sort of recreate that image, even with all the custom shop treatment and so forth. You know, if you're paying like $8,000 for a Strat, how much of that cost is the actual sound quality and playability? It's still a very small part of it, and most of the rest of that price is just the comforting illusion and the idea that you have somehow tapped into something that you couldn't otherwise get. Once again, to kind of echo what was talked about earlier, it's kind of a diversion from the art into a different set of priorities, maybe that is more imaginary, more of a fantasy than the reality of if your guitar functions and it's in tune, and everything's working on it, you're really 95% to where anyone has ever been with that. And I don't think it was the particular guitar that makes people love David Gilmour so much after all these years. It was that he recognized a tool that made sense for him in the present day of doing his work, and the work is what really transcended everything. And if you don't have that quality, then splitting hairs over whether you're buying a player Strat or a custom shop Strat is meaningless if you haven't developed the substance that the refining of the tool makes a difference for.
Yeah, I just feel more and more that there's a lot of stuff kind of, I think the middle of the market doesn't make sense anymore, and a lot of people have said that. So there's no need to go into any detail on that. And the budget market's always been there. I would still advocate for Squiers and maybe not so much Epi anymore, but the budget spectrum has gotten so good because they have to be, because they'll be, nobody will sell any of those more cost-effective instruments if they're not made well.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Rutherford used a Squier guitar on the last Genesis tour. So
yeah.
Who is going to tell us that they can't do what they need to do with the Squier?
Yeah, exactly. And then it's just, the boutique thing has just gotten to the point where there are a lot of channels and there are a lot of people who are much bigger in the space than us, who spend a lot of time on these instruments, these boutique instruments. And I just have to think that most people can't afford them, number one. Number two, the ethos behind them is a little suspect. And three, I mean, the people who are being emulated through these instruments they got there because they played them so much that they ended up looking like that or feeling like that or whatever. And, Gilmour's a great example. The Black Strat had how many different necks on it in its life? At one point, in its final iteration, I think all that was left was the output jack and maybe, what was it? Maybe a pickup cover or something were the only original parts of that guitar that were even left besides the body, So he was modding it. He was doing the same thing I do, chasing things, modding constantly, trying to get a good feel out of the instrument. So yeah. I just want to encourage people to do that. You could even just build a parts caster. Like what I've been amazed by is that the parts caster that I've done some videos on recently, the Catalpawood Strat that has changed so many times just in the past year plus of the channel or whatever, has now kind of landed. And I just, I am going to bring it into the studio when I start doing lead work. because I want to shoot one more video with it, and then it's coming in here, and it probably won't leave. And actually, my black Strat is probably on its way out to the shop. And that was just years and years of experimentation to get the right feel for what I wanted. And I think everybody's more individual than the idea that you need to spend $5,000 and buy something super expensive that will suddenly bring out all these great sounds. I think that you just find your own sounds, and then you get your instrument to make those sounds and feel as comfortable as possible while doing it. And that would be my whole point, you know.
Yeah, it's that's a you know, that can be a big thing for people to take on, that responsibility, that you can't offload that responsibility. You can't buy your way into that kind of accomplishment. I think it's maybe a proxy for you know, for status or for credibility. I've got this instrument, so, you know, so that somehow validates something at some point. It's much more vulnerable to not rely on the image of the tool and to say, where am I with my creativity? What am I making? What am I doing with it? Not saying you have to, you know, measure yourself against the most elite, technically proficient person on any instrument, but you know, to shift the focus away from the illusion that is around that tool to, okay, you know, what am I doing with it? You know, what's the purpose of having this? What is it for at the end of the day? That's a different kind of responsibility, but that's the portal to everything else. You can't spend enough on a guitar to have a substitute for that.
Yeah, and I guess my main complaint about the whole thing is just that the market has just become, it feels cynical at this point. You know, 100-watt tube heads and heavily reliced, really awesome guitars. I mean, I'm not putting down the themselves and what these companies are producing. No question,
they're good instruments.
But it's just like, you know, the money's crazy. And no, that's pretty much my whole point. Well, anyway, if you have watched the video up to this point, I would hope that you are going to subscribe if you haven't already. Likes and shares are greatly appreciated. Kevin and I love the comments section. We both check them regularly and jump in there. If you want to leave your 2 cents about anything that we've discussed today, please do. And we'll see you next time with another show. Take care.